Hello again, everyone. I promise you, this is the last time you'll see me today. It is my pleasure on behalf of Kiewit to moderate today's second general session of P3 2023. Kiewit is one of North America's largest and most respected construction and engineering organizations. Its development, construction, and design engineering professionals work on some of the industry's most complex, challenging, and rewarding projects. Whether it's boring tunnels through mountains, turning rivers into energy, or building bridges that connect communities. Kiewit Development originates and manages P3 and alternative delivery projects across North America, with some of Kiewit's most recent P3 projects being the Clecho All-Season Road in the Northwest Territories, the District of Columbia's Smart Street Lighting P3 project, and the Central 70 project in Denver. Today, we're going to discuss the American government's multi-trillion-dollar focus on rebuilding its infrastructure means and what it means for Canada. As the US's biggest trading partner and neighbor, many of the top infrastructure players active in Canada comfortably engage in projects on both sides of the border and are intrigued by the tremendous potential for growth in the US. So I guess we're going to explore a little bit what the impact might be on our market and the ability to successfully procure critical projects in an increasingly competitive market for labor, talent, materials, and funding. We'll explore a little bit about what lessons we can learn from the American way in approaching projects. To help me with this discussion today, I'm welcomed on the stage by Christopher Elmore, Vice President, Goldman Sachs, Marie Foley, Director of BTY Group, and Lawren Green, Senior Vice President of Kiewit Development. And again, before we get started, you've got the QR code for any questions for the panelists. Thank you all. Really glad that you guys could be here. I think this is going to be an interesting one because I think there's been a lot of talk about Canada in the context of the US and a lot of interesting things. So I'm really thrilled that we're going to explore sort of what's actually happening out there and what that means for us. Maybe to start, we'll start at the beginning, I guess. I'd love to hear from you guys on your views or your perceptions of the US versus the Canadian P3 market and pipeline. And maybe, Chris, I'll start with you.
Certainly, as the resident American carpetbagger, I'll do my best. So I think the broadest takeaway that I would have is, do you want a smaller, high probability pipeline, which is my perception of what you get in Canada, or in the US, a gigantic, extremely low probability pipeline? And that the US market has, for probably a little north of 15 years now, has always been described as almost there and up and coming and about to explode. And what we tend to see is that the number of successfully closed transactions slowly creeps up year over year with a bit of volatility, but that the number of possible P3s, rumored P3s, ones that get to the RFQ, maybe get to the RFP, but end up dying somewhere in the procurement process and the selection process, post-award, pre-close, tends to be extraordinarily high. So I think one of the big framings may be, although the US market is enormous, both in traditional and alternative delivery, it's also arguably 50 different markets, and more so than that, it can be lots of individual markets within every state. So as brief aside, I think Colorado is an interesting one. There are 5 successfully closed P3s in that state. There is 1 procuring authority that's done 2, and then 3 that have each done 1. And so you think about replicability and depth of pipeline. There, it's actually 4 different jurisdictions within a broader US pipeline. So I think there's a lot happening in the US, but for anyone on the Canadian side of the border worrying that there's suddenly going to be a gigantic, robust, replicable pipeline in the US that successfully reaches close, that will make it so that the US P3 conferences have as many people as the Canadian ones. I would not be too fearful of that, at least so far.
Lawren, you guys are on both sides of the border. How does that sort of settle with you guys?
I think that's right. I think, somewhat naively, because I work for an American company, obviously been active here in Canada for for close to 80 years. But, you know, having recently moved to the US, sort of before that, I would talk about the US market. And it is kind of a naive way to look at the market. It's 50 different markets and sub-markets within it. So I think it is a very big pipeline, but as Chris said, you know, the probability of projects getting all the way through, especially when you're talking sort of mega projects, I think is lower. You know, I think on the positive side, I think actually the broader construction pipeline in both markets right now is tremendous. We're seeing a ton of opportunities both in Canada and the US. That then does make it hard to decide where we're going to focus our efforts on both. And I think the only other, you know, I would say the degree of political risk I think is higher in the US on the types of projects we chase. They tend to be big, linear, people moving types of projects, roads, rail, sometimes there's tolls involved. Those are very political everywhere, and I think maybe stakeholder groups in the US are more used to being part of that decision-making and consultation process in some ways. So I think that can make projects harder to get across the line in many cases, and we certainly have seen that.
Marie, you're on both sides of the border as well, too.
Yeah, and I'd agree with everything that's been said. I think that a lot of the projects here, once we get on them, we know that 99% of them are going to hit financial close. But even if one of our US projects makes it to a preferred proponent stage, it can still be canceled. So it's a lot more risk being down there. But if we went back like 10 years ago, we definitely did I'd say like 70% of our P3 projects in Canada and maybe the balance in the US. And I think now that we're probably doing 50-50. We're seeing the standardization of agreements down there, but more on a sharing basis. Like we've got projects on the East Coast that suddenly the exact same contract has appeared on the West Coast. So we know how that we know the triggers in the contract to look for, and so do our clients. So it makes it a bit easier to bid. And I think that as we see more sharing of those contracts and the models, I think that we'll see more activity and people be able to pick them up and run with them. We just hope that the risk in those contracts doesn't end up with what happened in Canada, that people just started taking them off the shelf and not reassessing the risk on every project, which then pushed it too far. So we're hoping that they're going to read it through.
I think that's really helpful because I think there's a lot of people that sort of see a big country, a lot of money, and a lot of competition. So it's interesting to really kind of get the lay of the land from, you know, folks that are on the ground. I think that's good for us to know. But maybe, Lawren, I'll just pick up a little bit. We just had our opening general session talking about sort of the challenges and the opportunities we have in the Canadian market. And do you have any thoughts on what you heard?
Yeah, I think two things stood out for me. One was the concept of listening and using, you know, in this market, the CCM or commercial meetings process to do that. You know, I think it's very easy to sort of forget, and you go through the rote exercise of having a commercial meeting, and you have people at the meeting that are not empowered to sort of talk about risk and make decisions about risk. So I think, you know, both sides probably need to make sure they're listening and make sure they're getting the right sort of level of people to participate in those meetings. So that resonated for sure, and it was refreshing to hear that that's sort of how Newfoundland is approaching it, and prioritizing the concept of listening, which sounds obvious, but it's not always. The other is, and Joey mentioned it, you know, the supply chain issues are still a challenge, certainly. I think he was sort of making the comment that a lot of the things that we used to maybe take risk for in the construction world, we haven't been able to take risk on more recently. That is swinging back. But if I think about two individual procurements right now, the thing that's driving schedule is not how fast we can build it. It's not permitting. It's not utilities. It is actually how long is electrical switchgear going to take to get to site. And it, you know, goes from 74 to 94 weeks, and we have very little control over that. So I think, again, having sort of a pragmatic approach to trying to manage those risks. So those are probably the two things that I keyed in on.
Yeah, one of the interesting takeaways I had, which is a subset of, it was maybe a broader observation that's very interesting, that was actually a pretty big difference between the US and the Canadian market, is in the US, there are really no public sector procurement authorities, Center for Excellence, that do P3s for a living. And with rare exceptions, every P3 is the first time that that owner has ever done one. And even for repeat owners, I can only think of 1 or 2 examples in the entire US where the same humans were still there for the second procurement. So it was effectively a new owner. And that what often happens then is the expertise resides in the law firms and the financial and procurement advisors, which I think also goes to Marie's point where you see the same contract cropping up, you look under the hood and you're like, oh, it was the same lawyer or it was the same procurement advisor. And I think that it creates a very different dynamic. And as Lawren was thinking about listening sessions, where rather than having an organization who is actually tasked with having the expertise to think through risk allocation, the ramifications for that, what that means for incentive alignment and performance, you have an owner who's relying almost entirely on their advisors to give them advice on that in the context of the broader market. Sometimes that creates great opportunities of being able to have more up-to-date information across the US. It also sometimes creates the risk that you have effectively someone acting as an agent trying to make decisions on behalf of their principals, which may not always align with the goals of the principals versus an agent who wants to either get a deal done at all costs or show that they're really good at beating up the other side, neither of which necessarily lead to replicable high-quality projects that get delivered on time and on budget.
Do you think, though, that because, like you said, and I don't know who else is on these projects apart from humans, Chris, but you were saying that this can often be the first time that they've worked on those projects, that maybe when it's the first time you have a very optimistic view of how it's going to go, and then maybe up in Canada that we have the same people working on 100 projects, that their view is less optimistic, and so they're kind of battening down the hatches for everything that goes wrong. Because I heard the earlier session talk a lot about the P being psychology or being partnership, and that we need to get back to that and make it work. And I think that, sometimes when we're on projects that have, it's the first time this bidder has been in the market. And so they're bidding optimistically, they're bidding aggressively, they think they're going to get their foot in the door, and it's going to be a successful experience. And I'm wondering if, you've seen on the other side of that in the US, and maybe you, Lawren, that this optimism might actually have a positive impact on a project, or no?
I think that's an excellent point, and it's very mixed. So we see some where the owner will come in is really excited to think about, let's take the learnings from what's worked on our prior projects, what hasn't worked, and think about a model that has kind of the best of both worlds, and lets us do more of what we like and less of what we don't. And collaborating with their advisors to get to that outcome. We also see some where they come in where the optimism is, how can I extract more from my private partner? And those often don't work quite as well, because they'll say, well, what's the most aggressive position that's ever been taken anywhere in the US on every risk share and financing provision? And then I want all of the most aggressive ones in my contract, which often means you have a package of risk that maybe individually each of those are acceptable, but the entire package is not. Some of those, though, still ultimately have made it to close in the US because you have an optimistic bidder on the other side, and now you have someone who can walk around and say, well, here's precedent. It may not be good value, it might not be good risk allocation, it may not be good value for money, but it is replicable, sometimes unfortunately, precedent.
We've seen some of that on the district energy projects, that the KPIs that have been included in some of the later projects have been so high and unachievable that bidders actually had to drop out, because although bidders often plan to fail and include damages in there or penalties for not achieving those, it just became that you'd have a poor relationship and you'd be constantly in a state of default. Yeah. But sorry, go Lawren.
No, I was going to say, I think both sides also bring, for lack of a better term, sort of baggage to the deal. And I think as equity and contractors, we often bring probably over the last 3 to 5 years, I will say as a group, we've probably brought some sort of cynicism to the table because we've been talking about commercial points that haven't been adjusted, and you sort of get this feeling that you're sort of preaching the same message, but no one's listening. So even though that's the case, I think you owe every deal sort of the fresh start mentality, because the psychology component of the P3, if that's going to be the fourth P, is important, and coming to a deal sort of with collaborative intentions on both sides is so critical. And I think it's very easy to read the first version of the PA and just sort of shrug your shoulders and say, wow, they took the hardest line on every single commercial point. It's hard then to be positive, but it's something to continue to try to work on, or else you sort of do get to places where you're forced to drop out as bidders. Or
We've talked a lot about the Canadian markets evolving, and there used to be a time that we used to get a lot of delegates from the US wanting to come to Canada and learn, and we're now starting to see things happen in the US market. Do you think we're evolving in the same way, the Canadian and the US market? And are there maybe things in the US that they're doing maybe differently if we're not evolving the same way that we could learn from?
I think they're probably further ahead with this PDA process. They've been using that for a while, and I've seen it quite successful down there. So that's been great. They have, it began, in Canada with social infrastructure, vertical infrastructure, and it was always horizontal in the US. And I think that we're seeing them go into wastewater, and although you can argue that it's project finance, but student housing, we're seeing a lot of broadband deals, and we're seeing a mix of transit-orientated developments as well that are being built into these projects. So I think that they're diversifying their portfolio, let's say, much more rapidly than we saw happen in Canada. So the diversity is probably pretty even with what they operate in right now.
I think that's right. And I don't know, it's not as though one person is sort of saying, let's diversify. I think there is just more constituent parties in the US bringing deals to market, and that results in a diversification. And you have some jurisdictions that just legislatively are not allowed to do a design build or not allowed to do a P3. So you have that extra constraint. I would say, I think in the last 2 to 3 years, we're seeing more of a shift to considering revenue risk opportunities in the US than probably we are in Canada. I think in Canada, historically, there hasn't been. It's been an availability payment focused market with sort of limited exception. I think in the US, some of the bigger programs are sort of revenue choice lanes or managed lanes. The flip side of that is what just happened in Louisiana, where the project gets shut down for political reasons because tolls are political, especially in an environment where people's wages haven't kept up with inflation. So it's not easy to get a toll road or a managed lane project through. So.
And I think that's an interesting point, particularly for revenue risk transactions in the US. A lot of government owners, whether it's intentional or just kind of happens in the project development process, will sometimes end up kind of conflating delivery model and funding source, and will sometimes view P3 as a way where they say, well, I can't impose a toll as a government, but if I deliver this project and a third party is collecting it, that becomes easier, somewhat counterintuitively. I think we've also seen a drive, particularly on the revenue side, for, I think, some of the more thoughtful owners that will say, yeah, my core expertise and role might not be revenue management for a business that I currently do not have within my portfolio, but I still need to ensure that the service is available to my constituents, rather than having to get into the toll road business, get into the airline leasing business, get into the port business. What if I find someone who manages that commercial risk under a framework that either maximizes scope, minimizes costs for my constituents, or provides ongoing funding streams? So I think there is actually a fair amount of nuance there. I think the risk, though, is that the delivery model and the funding source sometimes get conflated, which then also creates the risk that the delivery model gets blamed for the funding source, which causes project cancellation.
You described at the outset, Chris, I think sort of, I'm trying to remember the words exactly, but large projects, low probability, smaller number of projects, higher probability is sort of the description of the two markets, which I think resonated with me when we prepared for this call. I hope it resonates with the audience as well too. But I guess for Marie and Lawren, how does that impact your business? What does the current state of the Canadian market, how does it affect how much you focus on things on this side of the border versus south of the border when you've got the two markets to enter into?
I guess I'm an advisor, so we're consultants. So Lawren talked earlier about people not listening, and this is my current state. So I talk a lot, it gets in. But yeah, so we're kind of a little bit agnostic to the model in that we'll work on these projects no matter the model. Definitely we see more value, including the operation and maintenance piece, because we do work on traditional projects and go back and visit them sometimes 10, 15, 20 years into their operation, and you can definitely see the difference between that and a P3 project that's been maintained. I think you only need to drive on the 407 and then go on the 401 to see the difference. So it's very different, but we're doing right now because a lot of the projects here have slowed down and we've diversified into other spaces, into long-term cares and student housing, which is kind of consistent across Canada and the US. We also see some of that in Ireland and the UK, and also looking at projects in the Caribbean. So I think that if you're nimble enough, there's a lot of work to keep us busy. And we're excited to see what happens with these collaborative models in Canada to get one that's far enough along that we can get involved and see some value there as well and share some lessons learned from these other areas.
Yeah, I think for me, our group, so we're the investment and capital side of Kiewit. So on that front, if I just think about what's in front of our team today and kind of over the next 12 or 18 months, it's 3 live P3 procurements in the US and probably another 4 within 12 months. I don't think we have a single Canadian P3 in front of us. Not to say the Canadian construction market isn't thriving, it certainly is. I mean, you don't have to look outside of the GTA to realize it's an incredibly exciting market in terms of what's happening here, but a lot of them are not happening as P3s, and that may be fine. So for my team, I'd say our focus is more on the US right now. It's a bit more US-centric. We are also sort of filling an internal role, as the project models evolve and the procurement models and the pricing models, you can get in debates about, is a progressive DB the same as a regular DB with a target price framework? I don't know, maybe. The need for kind of more complex commercial support on the progressive design builds or the design builds in any market, both internally and externally is bigger. So while we may not be bidding any Canadian P3s, we're providing sort of commercial support internally because those models have just gotten way more complex, frankly. So it's a bit of both, but from a pure investment standpoint, I'd say we are a little more US-centric. But
I guess
from a construction standpoint, both markets are pretty exciting right now.
I guess that leads to the question, and Chris, you mentioned it as well too, sort of the role of advisors, and Marie, you're in that space too. Are we at risk of losing people? Are we going to sort of have that brain drain of sorts heading down to the south and affecting our ability in the Canadian market to still deliver projects?
Well, we lost Lawren, so it's already begun.
I don't know if that's a brain drain.
I'll give a couple thoughts, and I think it'd be great to hear, Marie, Lawren, your views as well. I think one of the tempering factors there that we've seen a lot is the risk for your very large, low probability pipeline is whether it's on the side of looking to advise owners, where you can spend a lot of time, a project doesn't happen and you don't get paid, and have to go back to your boss and justify why did you allocate a team to this when you did not generate revenue. And on the bid side, it's a little bit scarier where you're going to incur bid cost. And I think, the refrain we'll often hear is, yeah, you incur bid cost and you lose and a transaction closes. That's the cost of doing business. You incur bid cost and you lose and nobody wins. You incur bid cost, you win, and then the project gets canceled. Again, it gets harder to tell that story. So I think that tempers the level of let's all just spend all of our resources in the US, because there's only so much, again, low probability work that you can do before you have 6 procurements in a row that some combination of you and everybody else loses. So I don't know, I could be surprised and maybe everyone's going to move south of the border, but my sense is it's a very different, it takes a different level of expertise. I think the second piece that we talked about was that the US is not a monolith. It is many different markets, and it is actually many different sub-markets within that. And that also creates a dynamic that I think, to be relevant and competitive and to have a nuanced understanding of what is happening, requires a pretty large commitment of people and resources, depending on the role you want to play. And so I think about many of my colleagues. I work very closely with a team of 100 people at my firm that do financing for cities, states, and local governments all across the US. And if I didn't work with that team, I would have no ability to understand the difference between how a mayor in this city thinks differently than the commissioner for this public authority versus the DOT director at this state, because it's like physically impossible for me to have a relationship with every single one of those people. And so I think in some ways, if you're going to commit to the US market, that requires a larger allocation of resources to have that nuanced set of relationships, given that there are only 2 or 3 places that transactions are going to come from. And it's hard, even if you said today, well, what are the states you should focus on? It wouldn't even be what are the states, it'd be what are the cities here, a few states here. But some of them, it might be, yeah, they've got a giant deal 4 years from now.
I don't know if it's going to be like a drain fast. I think that will constantly move people back and forth, but we could see people going into some other industries, like project finance industries, like power, energy, renewables. I think that there's huge opportunities there, and there's a lot more action there than what we're seeing in traditional vanilla P3 projects.
Yeah, I think that's right. I don't know if there's necessarily a drain, but I think there is people that have developed skills here on the finance and equity and development side that maybe are looking beyond traditional vanilla infrastructure P3, because it's sort of, you can take your project finance expertise and apply it somewhere else. On the back and forth on sort of the engineering or construction side, I think there's a lot of transit projects happening, for example, in North America, and those projects pull resources from everywhere because they're huge and they need to. So if you're an engineer working on rail, you're going to be working, the reality is, on projects probably in Toronto, potentially in Calgary, LA, there's just a huge number of projects there. It does mean, I think, that we are more selective about projects we're going to pursue, because it's a huge allocation of resources, and you need to sort of decide, are you going to allocate resources to a project that has a low probability or a high probability? Or are you going to allocate resources to an owner in jurisdiction that traditionally has taken a pragmatic approach to risk? Or are you going to take a flyer that they'll change it this time? So it does affect, I think, corporate priorities, certainly for us.
We had the parliamentary secretary here first thing this morning, and of course in Canada, the federal government is a significant funder of provincial, territorial, municipal, and Indigenous infrastructure. In the States, Chris, they've got the bipartisan infrastructure deal in 2021, the Inflation Reduction Act. What impact have these had on the market in the US, and has it sort of expanded the market because of these initiatives?
Yeah, so I think this will end up being a three-prong answer. Apologies if it's 2 or 4. And it's creating a set of drivers that are pushing in different directions that I think on net will create a larger pipeline of P3 projects over the intermediate term, so the next decade. But on any individual year, some of the other drivers might outweigh them. So I'd actually go all the way back to the enormous amount of various COVID-related stimulus that was put into cities, states, local governments, and public authorities. Many of our government clients have been telling us, yeah, we're sitting on billions of dollars of cash. Like, we don't need to finance anything for the next year or for the next 2 years until we've spent that down. So in the very short term, we see a lot of cash-related spending. In the immediate term, bipartisan infrastructure law, Inflation Reduction Act create a large number of programs that I think actually somewhat encouragingly, and sorry if this is too much background for everybody, but a lot of the folks in the Biden administration on the infrastructure side worked in the Obama administration during the 2008-2009 RS stimulus package. And the two things that they learned were that the concept of financing shovel-ready projects is actually really dumb, because if any project is shovel-ready, definitionally it's already found the funding. And so if you put more funding into those projects, it actually just cannibalizes other sources. If instead you put together programs that encourage local match for projects that have been on the shelf for a long period of time and can be advanced to shovel-ready in the next 5 years but aren't there yet, that then creates the hook for cities, states, local governments, public authorities to find those matching dollars and now move forward with the feds that will provide you the $200 million, the $500 million, the $2 billion hole in your mega project. And so we think that that's very encouraging for the medium-term pipeline, in that it allows a lot of government clients who historically have not had, they've have these projects they want to get done, but they can't quite get the financing together, that this is going to unlock a lot of those. And we see structurally that there's more value from a P3 procurement model in mega projects than for very small transactions. And given that, we think the overall thesis is you have an ability to close gaps for mega projects, which will create more mega projects in the intermediate term. Mega projects are better candidates for P3s, and so if you have more of them, you have more P3 projects. But it's a long way to get there, and it's not a, next year there are going to be 47 high-quality procurements. It's kind of in 25, 26, these $2, $3, $4 billion projects that have been on the shelf will start rolling forward.
We talk a lot in the Canadian context and have over the years about there's P3 projects, but then a lot of provinces they have programs, programmatic approach to the delivery of major infrastructure projects, whether it be the existence of Infrastructure Ontario, Sask builds, IBC. And so there, you've got sort of that knowledge transfer and that center of expertise. That project versus programmatic, is it the same approach in the States, or are we really looking sort of at a project by project basis? And I guess what I'm trying to drive at is what's the imperative for the P3 model in the US, and does it mirror what we're experiencing in Canada?
Unfortunately, I think it's very project by project. In some ways, I think that's encouraging because owners tend to be really thoughtful on what projects fit well in a P3 model versus other models, and kind of identifying those and moving them forward. The downside is that often a big driver for why a project may fit well as a P3 is that it's outside of the core expertise and experience of the owner for being able to deliver, operate, or maintain, which again creates more value, but then also somewhat definitionally means they have less internal expertise around the delivery and management of that project. I think there are some very rare exceptions. I think LA Metro has has tried. They have a programmatic approach. How well they've succeeded in doing that, I think we can have a conversation about. But they're trying. New York MTA is really thinking about programmatically incorporating P3 into a part of their delivery program. Given that they do about $10 billion of capital per year, even if only a tiny percentage is P3s, that actually could create a pipeline. But in many other jurisdictions, it's, we do a multi-billion-dollar project once every 15 years. Here's a multi-billion-dollar project. How should we deliver it?
Marie, you mentioned something off the top about sort of consistency, templates, and that sort of stuff. So, I mean, there are some folks that I think in Canada think that some degree of consistency across provinces in terms of their approaches to P3s is actually one of the benefits. And for some of them, they actually see it as a necessary condition for success. Are we seeing, you talked a little bit about it, but is that consistency there in the US in the same, knowing that it's a project by project approach as opposed to programmatic? How does it differ?
Yeah, we're starting to see more consistency. I think that, if we rewound like 15 years, every new project was like somebody just invented P3s down in the US. And I think that now we're starting to see some of the same elements, like I mentioned, on district energy, on courthouse projects, on prison deals. So we're seeing a lot more consistency. There are some areas where it's still kind of emerging without a model, like broadband projects, I think wastewater treatment projects, that we'd like to see it get there. But I think sharing that, coming up with the starting point, and if we use those templates as a starting point rather than here's the agreement, go for it, I think that will get better results. People know how to react to that and how to bid it. I also think like consistency, we're starting to see teams form more consistently. And when we're looking at like Canada and the US, one of the big challenges that we have up here is that there's not enough bidders, right? On the construction side or on the operations side. They have similar challenges in the US, but we're seeing larger companies come in and partner locally. So because we're seeing them partner locally with construction contractors and even operators and share their expertise to bring them up into that space. So we're seeing that happen a lot more often, and maybe using the same smaller partners on more than one project, which then gives them the experience, the expertise that they can bid more aggressively and feel like they're more in control of those projects, and actually give some feedback from one project that will impact the next project successfully.
Lawren, how does Kiewit view sort of that need for, or not the need for consistency?
Yeah, I mean, I think historically, I think that consistency, in Ontario, Alberta, BC, at the start of the programs was what made them successful. Sort of, you could replicate the RFP and the PA. It allowed you to bring projects to market faster. But that made sense because they were, at least at the start, one or two asset classes. It was healthcare, it was justice, potentially, some roads. So you had sort of a template that worked. I think as you try to take the template and apply it to projects that are different or projects that aren't as ready as they were. So, the standard risk allocation on utilities works if the owner had 3 years to relocate utilities. But as projects were coming to market faster, people were beholden to a risk allocation, for example, on utilities. Those owners hadn't had time to go out and do the utility work. So the paper no longer matched the sort of actual on-the-ground risk. And I think there's a real danger of you're so tied to the template that you can't stop and think about the risk and what it really means. Now, the flip side of it, as Marie said, is in the US, there's the template. There's very few jurisdictions that do enough projects like IO does or like Partnerships BC. Infrastructure BC does. So some of the templates are actually advisor-driven. There's a Nossaman project agreement. There's an Ashurst project agreement. So they tend to be sort of advisor-driven. I think we're seeing some changes, though. Design Build Institute of America. I think more and more owners are looking at their framework DB agreement as a good starting place. I think AIAI as an advocacy group has done some good work trying to get to sort of a key terms best practice, which I think we're seeing pick up at the state level, but also, frankly, at the city level, which is really interesting, that cities and municipalities are looking for those templates because they don't necessarily have a view that they've done this before, so they have a template. So I think it's moving in the right direction.
I was going to ask about that. I mean, we see a bit of a difference in the municipal sector here versus the provincial, especially where there's a provincial agency in place. So do we see the difference in the states too, in terms of state-owned infrastructure versus municipal?
100%, and I would, yes. I haven't been there long enough to have figured it all out either, but it is very different. But even within, I mean, here you have Infrastructure Ontario procures provincial projects, irrespective of the ministry. In the US, for example, it's the DOT does transportation. The Transit Authority does transit. They'll have an agreement between them. Maybe, yeah. But so they're very different, I would say.
Are there things we could learn from, I mean, you talked a little bit, I think, Marie, you're kind of getting at that cookie cutter, it's not a cut and paste sort of exercise, but are there things that we can learn from sort of how the approach is in the US that we should maybe consider in Canada, given, I mean, we're, 30 plus years into this, right? When you can look at a newer jurisdiction, I mean, we did it to the UK and Australia in some ways, right? Yeah. Are there things that we can learn from that?
I'm not sure if either. I think everybody should be learning, like you said, from these advisors who are on probably more projects than any of the bidders even are on. I think that there's lots to be learned there. But I do think that there's some things that we could take here to share down in the US, particularly around how we incorporate Indigenous groups into these projects and give them equity stakes, like the work that First Nations Major Projects Coalition is doing, I think is fantastic, and there should be more of that happening. It should be a bigger discussion topic down in the US than it is on these projects. And yeah, we could have a whole panel just on that. It's something that I feel very strongly about and that I know they're doing fantastic work. And First Nations Major Projects Coalition is advising groups down in the US as well, so they're trying to push that forward. There are things that are happening down there that we've already done very well up here. School projects, for example, bundling of projects. We've bundled schools, we've bundled MTO projects, we've bundled OPP stations, we've even bundled hospitals, they've bundled bridges. We could consider that, they've started bundling the schools. That has been seen as a very positive experience for them with the Prince George County Public Schools. So now they're moving to a phase 2. And I think that in order to get other municipalities involved, we need to share more of those experiences that we've had with other assets here. When I was first working on the Prince George County Public Schools for one of the teams, one of the advisors that was advising on that project asked, have you ever seen a bundled school before? And I think we've got 5 or 6 different bundled school projects here up in Canada. So increasing the awareness, I think, is really important on both sides about the successes and about the drawbacks, and what we can do to prevent things would be helpful.
I'm going to pick up on the asset classes in a second, but Lawren, is there anything you think in terms of what you're learning in your experience in the US that we might take away?
One thing that's sort of refreshing, and it's maybe it's the quasi-government, sort of the mush sector, and we're seeing a sort of philosophical shift that there's value in a P3 or a D-boom framework, whatever terminology you want to use, that we're seeing some, university clients, healthcare clients decide we want to educate people and we want to do research. We don't want to be utility operators, and we think there is private sector expertise there to do that, whether it's utility work, whether it's water work. So I think that slight shift in philosophy is actually really refreshing right now in the US, and I think it's probably starting here, but is not as far along, because I think it goes back to the heart of why you do a P3, and it should never be about cost of capital. If it's a cost of capital decision, you're sort of doing it for the wrong reasons, because it will never be as cheap on a cost of capital standpoint. But I think if you're doing it for the philosophical reason of, I'm not an operator, I don't want to be an operator, but I want best-in-class operators to inform the design and construction of this project, So that would be the one I'd say that the U.S. I think right now certainly, and we're working on a couple other sides of the table and same side of the table in that space.
Yeah, I think the refrain that we've been using for some of our clients is starting to resonate is what's critical but non-core. And thinking about should that be on your balance sheet, not just from a financial perspective, but from kind of an operating risk profile perspective, or are there places that you should actually be partnering with someone instead? And as Lawren was saying, resonating more with our higher ed and hospital clients, but we're starting to get traction with our traditional government clients as well.
To pick up on the asset class conversation that Marie started a second ago, I mean, we heard this morning you had sort of Joey on the social and Nitan on the civil, and we've got a wide breadth of experience across Canada in terms of a variety of asset classes. And you pointed to bundling as an example of things that we've tried as well too. But I think you pick up the trade publications and newspaper, and you see things going on in the States, and you kind of think, oh, maybe there's an opportunity here. So are there projects and asset classes that you're seeing in the US that maybe we should, start to consider, or, in Canada, or opportunities that, maybe we haven't thought about yet?
It's interesting that we've worked on more canceled district energy projects in the US than we have on district energy projects in Canada.
It's depressing.
Yeah, and then like the ones that have actually gone forward, there's a lot of district energy ones that have gone forward. So I think that we could do more district energy projects here successfully. I think we should see, more bundling of projects. Like I think it was interesting, the Penn Bridges projects were very interesting. We could see more of that. And then I think that a lot of them are in the process right now, but a lot of these PDA projects that are transit-oriented development or that are using actually residential with a combination of municipal together we're hopeful of that. We're seeing broadband projects happen on both sides, but they're much larger in the US and they're growing more rapidly. I don't know about you guys. And airports, of course. I know that we had panels on that before about airport projects in Canada and should they happen, but we have seen them quite successful in the US and the Caribbean.
Yeah, certainly I think the sort of energy as a service, whether it's heating, cooling, actual electricity as a service, is one asset class I think we're definitely seeing more of in the US. It would be nice to see here as well. I think I mentioned managed lanes or, as an aspect of toll roads. So the whole road may not be tolled, but certainly one or two lanes may be as a way to ease congestion in city centers. I think we're seeing that in areas where, similar to the GTA, you've got sort of an economic engine that's fairly spread out across the geography, and you need people to move from Toronto to Hamilton to Vaughan, same way they need to move from Nashville to Knoxville, or move around Atlanta or move around Denver. So I think it would be nice to see that come across. And I think there's some real value from an economic standpoint in some of those projects.
Yeah.
Chris, I want to pick your brain a little bit because I think, sometimes our experience, we get, I've heard us described as maybe a bit boring on the financing side. Like I think lack of innovation. I think we've got sort of pretty standard, 90-10, 85-15 gearing ratios. Yeah. No, exactly.
It's only the socks, though.
I mean, I think if people know what they're getting into, I think in the Canadian context. So recognizing that, there's ways to go in bringing revenue or demand risk, and as Lawren was just saying, to the market. Are there things of note on how projects are financed in the U.S. that we should know or understand?
Yeah, I'll give two observations, and most of them may be a cautionary tale for don't try them at home if you can avoid it. I think one of the really big differences in the U.S. market is that we have had, and actually the first bond market in the world was the U.S. municipal bond market. So rewind 40 years, there wasn't a corporate bond market, there wasn't a sovereign bond market, everything was bank loans except for U.S. municipalities who sold bonds that are tax exempt to the owners. That does two things. One, it creates a distortion where there's a massive cost of capital advantage through a tax arbitrage that governments have from directly owning and delivering projects, and they get through a P3. And so that creates a second layer of complexity on a value for money analysis that's driven by exogenous third-party, effectively tax factors. But then there are a few projects, private projects, which are able to take advantage of that market, and that creates a massive universe of financing flexibility that's mostly driven by that market having been around for so long. It's willing to do candidly do a lot of things and take risks that more traditional bond markets and life insurance companies wouldn't necessarily look at. But I would add with that, the overarching caveat that creates a lot of weird inefficiency around your project delivery selection. So I think there's risk for trying to implement that. I think the second one, candidly, I think the Canadian Infrastructure Bank is vastly more thoughtful about how and when it provides, and its flexibility within its statutory mandate for how it can support projects, versus in the US, the federal loan programs that exist, TIFIA and RIF, are pretty bureaucratic and nightmarish. They're extraordinarily flexible within a very well-defined statutory framework. And I think having slightly less flexibility on a much broader statutory framework helps solve the actual problems of getting, finding the hole in the capital stack and moving projects forward. The one place I think that there is, and we've seen more area of innovation for some projects, has been within revenue risk transactions. And I think that has less to do with the capital structure itself and more so in a revenue risk framework where you have more ability to actively manage the business, your interest rate exposure, your refinancing risk. You see a much broader range of tools and approaches, which then have a different risk profile to both the sponsor developer and the ultimate government counterparty that we've explored and used in the US.
We have just a few minutes left, so maybe I'll take this opportunity for some sort of closing thoughts for you guys. I mean, I think there's not a specific theme for this conference, but I think there are some themes emerging in terms of the conversations that we're having. So what would you say, I'll put this to all three of you, are some of the key takeaways for this room to think about when we are really focused on evolving our market and building that sustained pipeline of projects across the country? Marie, I'll start with you.
I think something that I think we need to improve on both sides, because we're very similar on both sides, is the loss of knowledge throughout the project, from the intent of creating the project, bidding the project, the construction, the commissioning, the operations. There's a huge loss of knowledge in that time frame that then we're deep into the operations of a project, and maybe it's not as profitable as what was originally intended by the operator. And I think it's something that we need to work on, how to improve that on both sides, because we see the operators losing knowledge, but we also see the other side is losing knowledge in the intent of the contract. So that's something that I think that we as an infrastructure community need to put our heads together, how to improve that to make the project successful for everybody, because there's no point in somebody losing money on this project. The intent isn't that private sector is losing money on these projects, is that we're all successful. I'd also love to see somebody do a study on, because there's many studies in Infrastructure Ontario, do one on, were these projects on budget, were they on schedule? I'd love to see the traditional projects, were they on budget, were they on schedule? If we're going to do a 15-year check-in in projects that were P3s, I think we should be doing a 15-year check-in on projects that are traditional to see how they're turning out, and look at the differences and then go back and say, is this really value, and use that as a tool and learn from it, genuinely learn from it, and not push it to shift our own agendas and that. So I think that's important, and also getting creative with the models to include more sectors, I think, and smaller projects is something that I would like to see.
Chris?
Maybe taking a slightly different direction, and maybe this is a rose-colored glasses view looking north. But I think something for the Canadian market to think about is, how do you continue to leverage the expertise and the centers of excellence from the provincial level procurement authorities? Because there's a huge wealth of knowledge and consistency that exists within those organizations that is entirely absent in the US. And that there's, I think, a level of comfort that other government entities take from another government organization, even if it's a city to a state, on providing expertise and guidance that isn't, when we're working with governments, we like to think that we're a neutral broker and we're trying to help them out. But I also understand that they get it. I get paid if they successfully deliver a project that they hired me for. Can be an incentive alignment and incentive disalignment there. So I think finding ways to leverage that expertise and leaning into that and using that, I think, can be really differentiated in your market and your ability to identify and successfully procure high quality, successful transactions. That's something we just don't have in the US, and candidly, given how traditionally libertarian of a country we have been, I find very low probability that we ever will have.
Lawren?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing, so I think both markets are very exciting still from a construction standpoint. Irrespective of sort of procurement model, I think there's super exciting things happening here in Toronto, south of the border, out west in Canada, out east in Canada. So, cautiously optimistic that continues. I think we probably are going to see some form of sort of, I don't know if slowdown is the right word. I think people are going to be maybe a bit thoughtful as we probably move into some level of recession on both sides of the border for some period of time. So I think people just we'll see maybe a potential pause. The last point, though, for me is really just, I think, pragmatic approach to sort of the risk allocation, and don't assume that a new procurement model solves bad project management and bad risk allocation. It still makes sense to get out early as an owner, public or private, of your project and be doing the things that need to be done to de-risk the project. And it sort of behooves all of us to make sure we're coming to the table with solutions to risk, as opposed to this is how we've done it in the past. We've seen how that works. You get no bids, or people go bankrupt, or lose money. And I don't think that does not help the system. So just be thoughtful about the risk allocation. And P3s should still have a place, I think, and not be tossed out for sort of things that were not P3 related, frankly. They might have been DB risk allocation or O&M risk allocation, as Marie mentioned, around KPI, nothing to do with the model.
Well, thank you very much to our panelists. A huge round of applause for our panelists. Really appreciated it. Thank you, all three of you.